My grandmother Sylvia and her husband Joe ran a store in downtown Greensboro from 1939 till 1997. The history is they began that Joe was they were taking new North Carolina furniture from New York, from here, and sending it to New York, and they realized the trucks were coming back empty. So they started to fill them with repossessed Depression era surplus. They moved from the furniture to Army surplus, and that was really the business that they were building. They ran that business until about 1955, and then my grandfather passed suddenly of a heart attack. My mom was 12, she was the oldest, two younger brothers. The Army surplus business sort of came to an end. Eventually, over time, she began getting into just general thrift. And then over time, just more and more things were being accumulated.
As a kid, like, what was it like? What did it feel like exploring the space when you were?
You know, for me, it was like an adventure. So I'd come here and I'd help like sell things, and then I'd like scurry in the back and just dig through boxes for hours and hours. But it always felt like a place where I was much more interested in finding things and toys and playing with them and then hiding them again so I could find them again. It was like that, you know, that box you might have in your grandmother's house that's like the box of toys.
Yeah.
It was an entire building full of that. But it was also like this place you would just sort of creep through, and like, you know, as soon as you pulled one thing out, there would be a million other things that you just start pulling out, right? So what we have now in this very orderly fashion where you can walk around and move and are like really comfortable in a way, there it was like you couldn't even sit down. Hi, my name is George Shear. I'm co-founder and director of Elsewhere, a living museum and artist residency set inside of a former thrift store downtown Greensboro. Myself and Stephanie came down along with our friend Josh Boyette, and we came down to Greensboro actually for a concert. After the concert the next morning, I was like, you gotta check out my grandmother's old store. It's been locked up for 6 years, and no one knows what to do with it. So over time, we began to develop this idea, and Stephanie and I and Josh began talking through this idea of what if we were to come down here and move into the store and decide that nothing would be for sale and nothing would leave, and instead treat it like this massive puzzle or this sort of singular set, this archive.
At what point was that clear to you guys? Like, that nothing's for sale?
Day two.
Day two. Day one, you're gonna make $1 million.
Day one, we tried to set up a stand outside, and there was the group that had come down before me, my friends Josh and Matt.
Uh-huh.
There was an arts and antique festival, and so they created this little tent, and they like hung a bunch of stuff. And in their mind, they were really excited about this idea of building a community space, and in their conception of it, we had this space, we needed to clean out as much as we could, move it upstairs, and open up the space so that we could have a like cooperative, communal living
Yeah.
hippie co-op.
Yeah.
And so when they were down here, there was an arts and antique festival, and so they took out a bunch of dresses, and like there was even, I think, a big bin full of toys, and it was like free. No one took anything from right, because it was all antique shoppers, and so everyone was like, "This is not our gig." Like plastic. And then I came down like 2 days later and was like, "Nope, none of it's for sale." And you know that the idea that instead we would like use this material and we sort of sculpt the whole thing from within, that we were undoing this sort of artifact, this time capsule, right, that had come to exist over 60 years. You know, and that still continues today, right? Like every artist that's reinstalling another artist's work or is transforming the rooms, they're like constantly responding to all these other conditions. They're having to work with all these other materials. Like there's no like clear it out, move it, put it in a box, push it away. The history is embedded in this place. It is an archive and a time capsule of 60 years of this town, and also 60 years of like America. And rather than like sell this stuff or get rid of it or put it away or turn it into a stale museum, we're actually going to invite some of the most creative, critical, engaged minds of our generation to come in and use these things to make works that become publicly available and interactive and engaged, and at the same time rethink what the museum can be in the 21st century. the idea of a collection comes from the idea that this is a museum, or that it's a store where nothing's for sale that became a museum. And we sort of created this idea of a museum in part for a few reasons. One was to tie to this notion of the original museums, the cabinets of wonder, right, the Wunderkammer, which were these like collections, these princely collections in Europe, the prototypes of museums, where all the objects were all over the place, right, and they were all displayed throughout these caverns, and it was sort of the treasures of the world. And again, they presented a certain totality of what we thought the world was, right, through the things that were collected from faraway lands.
This is the postmodern museum.
It is certainly a reflection and a deconstruction of the concept of a museum. First off, that museums frame works on white walls, but it also brings in the notion of living. Artists used to live in the Louvre at a point. The museum is a production site, right? And you'd have a lot of spaces or galleries that now, alternative sites, project spaces that invite artists to like make work in the space and then put it up in the space, right? So there's that thing happening also. So already the like practice of making art is like, right, because as artists we think, okay, I have my studio and that's where I make.
Yeah.
Right, and then this is a weird circumstance where all the materials are available to me and the spaces that I make in are available to me. But now, for the first time this year, there's this component of like, oh, and actually there's like a public interrupting you. But also just in a very practical way, like people like don't know what to do with themselves. A museum helps guide them. So you have a living space, but also like a living, not even just like sleeping, but like cooking, eating, living, right? So when you put things into the context of the museum, it becomes in a way on display, it becomes in a way public, right? And museums are generally constructed around that. Our world is constructed around that, right? And you get, our world is constructed around the gaze.
How does like working in the South affect the work that's done here?
I mean, the South is a really important place because they sort of say that so goes the South, so goes the nation. There are ideas that need to change here. There's great, amazing cultural resources here. There always have been. But there is a deeply rooted culture here that needs to transition and shift. And the work that's required to do that, the people are here doing that work. It doesn't need someone from outside to come in and do that work. There are people here doing that work. But that work needs to be done, and it needs to be done here critically. And if we can change the kind of embedded cultures that do exist here, the certain conservatism that exists here, the racism that exists here, if we can address the histories that the South has around class and race, and transform people's perceptions and transform the way that people live in this world, then we can, not only can we do it in other places, it will have an immense effect on all the other places.
Yeah.
It will drive their potential. It will drive them to make the changes that they ultimately need to make as well. And at the same time, I also think that like as artists are looking for opportunities, and they're having to look more and more outside of the major centers, the structures, or the power structures, the networks, the structures of the network, to really make a difference, show differently in a way. You just have to sort of go a little further out into a frontier. Even the university is like this moment of growth, and then you're like out into the world, and it's like, now you're what? Like, you're gonna be a writer? I just like, went to a university and got an amazing degree and like studied writing, and now I'm gonna what am I gonna do? What are my stories? What am I responding to? Who are the people that I'm engaging with? What's my community look like? What was unique is that all the stories, all the potential, all the characters, their addresses, every tiny minutia of detail is already written in the world. It doesn't need to be made up. And it all exists within this building.
Yeah.
There's just that much stuff in here that every single little detail and possibility can come from truth. It's just a matter of rearranging them to tell the story that you want to tell. And so that was kind of our goal. That was kind of our idea, is to let this space speak through a process of continued arrangements and rearrangements. To assume that the page already is filled with words, it's just a matter of putting them in order. So, I mean, part of our mission is to connect global artists with local neighbors, and I think that you can have that kind of impact in a place like Greensboro. You can work with lots of different groups, and you can meet a lot of different people and connect people that otherwise are not necessarily engaging with artists or have experienced an artistic life. The idea, I think, was that we wanted this space that was totally outside the realms of familiarity, and yet was connected to so many things that were familiar. And I was just giving a tour to this woman today. She's in her 70s, and she came into the space. Went through all 3 floors, and when she came back down and walked out onto the street, she was like, "Oh, and the world is here." Right? And it was that moment of having gone through the entire building, room by room, seeing all these different spaces, moving from a room filled with army surplus to a room filled with an artist painting on the walls and doing projects, to rooms full of fabric, to old boarding house rooms, to bedrooms, to kitchen spaces, right? All these moments that are all just like flashes as you pass through so many different spaces compressed, and so many different objects that at every moment it's like, that's from the 80s, that's from the 60s, that's from the 70s, that's from the 90s. At every moment you're seeing time compressed, and you're seeing everything present all at once and configured in unique ways, that by the time you walk out of the space and you step back onto the street and you like see the rain, you feel the rain, you see cars, and you look at the sidewalk and you look at restaurants and stores and so on and so forth, it suddenly becomes strange. The world becomes strange. And that's what Elsewhere needs to be doing. That's what Elsewhere does. For me, the most exciting idea of over the next 40 years is that Elsewhere truly becomes a home for artists around the world and is cared for by artists around the world who utilize it in its resource and utilize it as a platform to create projects of their own, right? So, yes, the museum, yes, the residency program, yes, the kitchen and queer lab and all these like operations that we have, but the moment when like an artist that was here in 2009 or was here in like 2020 who 10 years later decides to organize a group of artists to come down and run a project here or have a conference or embed themselves and produce their next work that they've been thinking about for the last 10 years.
Yeah.
That to me, like when this really becomes this like centerpiece and home for like some of the most amazing critical creative thinkers, and this becomes a dock for them, a hub for them, right? Not a moment, not an isolated moment of a movement that happens in Paris and then disappears over time, but actually like a sustained, available space where people continue to like touch and connect through. That to me is the excitement of the next 40 years.
My name is Emily Ensminger. I am the program curator at Elsewhere Museum. So collection is materials that were found by George and Steph when they entered the space in 2003. A further explanation is that those collection is materials that Sylvia Gray, George's grandmother, purchased between 1939 and 1997. The rules are somewhat dependent on the materials. So through the proposal process, that's when we get an opportunity to talk through some of those things.
But none of the collection stuff ever leaves.
Yeah, that's a really important part. None of it leaves, and we also don't accept in new materials.
And so from all of these things, this is kind of like the materials that the artists work from.
Right. Yeah, because we do let, like, we have, currently we have a lot of artists interested in new kinds of media that just didn't exist before 1997.
Yeah.
Like a lot of the, like, lighting technology that, say, Jane is working with. So Southern Constellations brings artists that have been, that were raised or currently based in the South into, they get funding to do our residency. The idea is that this happens annually and that we're building a network of experimental artists, experimental projects, and experimental spaces all over the South through the Southern Constellations program. The resident rooms were built by artists, so they're also installations really beautiful and highly textured. I think the physical parameters of the space force people also to have to connect faster than you would, say, if you had a more traditional situation, like you went to a residency and it was, everybody had their own room. So there's a certain level to, the parameters that are set up in our space that also, I think, help it, although people find them challenging. Such as living so closely together and sharing a kitchen and sharing a dining hall in a public museum. And
so when you're sweeping or something like that, can you talk about finding collection stuff while you're sweeping and that sort of process of saving the things?
Yeah, because the museum is a living museum, we kind of like to, and this was one thing I worked really hard with House to build, is respecting the things that I think most people consider annoying and hard to do and nobody wants to clean. So I was trying to kind of elevate or change the attitude that's traditional in our culture. The collection just can't leave the space. So no matter how small something is, I'm looking around on the ground right now and I see something that I can't really reach, but you wouldn't throw away a little piece of blue ceiling that's right there.
What would you do with it?
You would save it, and I showed you during the clean, you just put it somewhere funny. Sometimes things have places to go. If you find a button, I know there's jars of buttons, but sometimes it's the most miscellaneous stuff, and you can hide it in the wall, although that's harder now that our walls are all done. But you can find cracks. I see some cracks.
Interesting.
So, and the only thing we don't really save anymore is dust. I think that there are very few artists who are able to experience our residency in their regular life. So for me, it's for them to have an exceptional experience that they cannot get anywhere else. I hope that artists build networks while they're in residence that they keep for, the rest of their lives, or maybe it's something, even if it's not forever, they still maybe reach out to, maybe they collaborate together in a future project. A third thing that I hope artists take away is a really stellar project that, and that's in a new style that they're not used to. So maybe they're an artist who actually doesn't do a lot of interactive work, but now they've made something that is interactive. Hoping that kind of sets them on a new kind of trajectory in their practice, which I've heard from a lot of artists that, speaking to quite a few, that is often the experience
Yeah.
that they have. I do think that I'm starting to understand that everyone's process is really, really different. I'm starting to understand that, comfort doesn't always benefit somebody, to make sure that they are comfortable and they feel supported, but they're still being challenged, and that we're not just producing work for them.
Mm-hmm.
Those things matter to me. Yeah, I think that elsewhere can be a really challenging space, and it's more and more challenging the more you try to resist it. If you learn how to work with it and accept problems or problem solving, you'll have a different kind of experience than if you try to resist and fight and get around all the things that come up with the rules around the collection and the fact that we share responsibilities of cleaning and cooking and there's a few reasons why, but I think for me, I am from the South and wanted a reason to return personally. Was having a really hard time finding a city or a organization, this is 5 years ago, but still, finding an organization that matched the kind of experimental life that I live or want to live. And so when I found Elsewhere, it just felt so rare, and I don't think it should be. So when I found Elsewhere, I don't know, I just felt like, I love the South, and but I also don't want to sacrifice creative community. And I felt like everyone I knew that was an artist was leaving the South for, larger centers. And I just want to be a part of changing that, just taking what already exists in southern cities and southern places and encouraging that we stay and that we build networks and grow stronger. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think Elsewhere, it would be a totally different thing if it was not in the South and it was not in Greensboro. My observation is that people are, especially within our generation, cannot afford the quality of life that they want in some of the urban centers, and so are trying harder or spending more time thinking about how they can make it work for themselves in the places that they're from. I'm not sure what's happening in all cities, but my feeling is that we are in the middle of a very important time where people want to make it work for where they live. In order to make their dreams come true and live the quality of life they want, they don't think that they need to go to an urban center. I think they believe they can make it work where they're from. Mm-hmm. And so the South isn't kind of losing its creative class to other places. I think people they've shifted how they think about their career paths or their identity, and they don't have to reject a Southern identity in order to live their life. Off of the ceiling.
Until
they did this. Yeah, you just have to be careful, dodging, that one looks loose this week. Everyone, at the house meeting, be careful, there's, a loose ceiling tile.
How long was the renovation planned? To for?
It was supposed to start. It was supposed to start in November, and then shit just with construction projects goes on way longer than you expect. Also, it's just, it's hard to raise that kind of money for an organization our size.
Yeah,
and also,
how much, if you're allowed to say,
I don't remember the exact amount, but it was it's in the, I think 800,000. We're blazing a path, and we don't always,
fit in a box. Right.
So we end up looking to other models, older, more traditional residencies, sometimes even stepping out of art models into other stuff. It's I did a whole road trip across the country and visited places like Penland, which is, you know,
Yeah.
really old residency, has well funded. It's huge. They've got tons of buildings, lots of property, lots of money. But it helps to look at those, even if we work on them in a very micro scale,
Yeah.
like work in the same.
Have you heard of Space? I guess you Space on Ryder Farm. It's in New York.
No, but I feel like you mentioned it.
It's started by like alumni of our school, and it's like a residency thing on a farm.
Yeah, it sounds awesome.
It's like this except outside. You
Yeah.
know, like
How long have they been around? They're new.
6 years.
Okay. Oh, so that's pretty good. 6 years
Yeah.
is great.
Yeah, I think it's 6 years.
Okay, cool.
So it's just now starting to like really. So a lot of playwrights
Yeah.
go up there, and then a lot of the acting students intern the way like Cassidy and them are interning,
Oh yeah.
and then these playwrights, who are really well known, write their new plays, and the acting students like get to read them
Yeah.
and act in them while
Yeah.
they're being workshopped. So
That's so great.
kind of the-
I love one thing I really think like at Elsewhere one thing I love is that, or at least my experience has been coming from like, you know, the Art Institute of Chicago, a very, you know, well-known art school, is that actually at Elsewhere, and maybe because George and Steph were writers, we work with activists, we work with, you know, filmmakers, we work with theater, more traditional theater, and so we're all over the place in terms of like who we're working with, and then it's like you find out about spaces like the place you're talking about.
Yeah.